On a scorching June morning in 1899, in the remote plains of eastern Texas, a neighbor's routine visit to the Yates farmstead would uncover a scene so horrific that it would haunt the small community of Cedar Creek for generations. Inside the modest wooden house, 5 young children lay silent in their beds, their lives taken by the very hands that had once cradled them to sleep. Margaret Yates, a woman once praised as the perfect frontier wife, had methodically ended the lives of her own children before attempting to take her own. But this wasn't the work of a monster. This was the tragic culmination of a slow psychological destruction that everyone had seen, yet no one had truly understood. The signs had been there for months, whispered about in hushed conversations at the general store, dismissed as nothing more than a mother's temporary melancholy. What really drove a devoted mother to commit such an unthinkable act? The answer lies buried in the suffocating isolation of frontier life, the crushing weight of impossible expectations, and a community's failure to recognize the desperate cries for help that echoed through the Texas plains like wind through an empty house. Before we delve deeper into this haunting tale from the forgotten corners of Texas history, this channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the darkest chapters of American frontier life. If you're ready to uncover the truth behind stories that others dare not tell, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We have a community of true mystery seekers here, and if you've made it this far, you're clearly not like most people. Now, let me take you back to that fateful summer when the heat of the Texas sun couldn't compare to the fire of madness that consumed the Yates family. Cedar Creek, Texas, in 1899 was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Yet somehow the most important secrets remained hidden behind closed doors. This small farming community of barely 300 souls sat like a lonely outpost in the endless expanse of eastern Texas, where the nearest real town was a full day's ride away. The land was harsh but honest. It rewarded hard work and punished the weak without mercy. It was exactly the kind of place that attracted men like Thomas Yates, a sturdy German immigrant who had arrived 5 years earlier with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable belief that the American frontier would make him rich. Thomas had claimed 160 acres under the Homestead Act, built a modest 2-story house with his own hands, and established himself as one of the more prosperous farmers in the area. His wheat fields stretched as far as the eye could see, golden waves that danced in the endless Texas wind. But a successful farm needed more than just hard work. It needed a proper wife, someone who could bear children, manage a household, and serve as a pillar of moral strength in the community. That's where Margaret O'Sullivan entered the story. At 19, she was considered almost too old for marriage by frontier standards, but her beauty and reputation for gentleness made her a prized catch. She had grown up in Austin, where her father worked as a clerk for the state government, a comfortable middle-class life that had given her education, refinement, and absolutely no preparation for the brutal realities of frontier farming. Her parents, desperate to secure her future before she became a permanent spinster, eagerly accepted Thomas's marriage proposal after only 2 brief meetings. The wedding took place in the spring of 1892. A simple ceremony at the small Methodist church that served Cedar Creek's scattered faithful. Margaret looked radiant in her mother's altered wedding dress, her auburn hair pinned up elegantly, her green eyes bright with hope and determination. The townsfolk remarked on what a handsome couple they made. Thomas with his broad shoulders and serious demeanor, Margaret with her gentle smile and refined mannerisms that spoke of better breeding than most frontier women possessed. In those early years, Margaret seemed to embody everything a frontier wife should be. She learned to milk cows, churn butter, and tend a vegetable garden that became the envy of other wives in the area. She could preserve fruits and vegetables, mend clothes with intricate stitches, and cook meals that made Thomas the most envied husband in 3 counties. When she gave birth to their first child, William, in 1893, the other women praised her natural maternal instincts and predicted she would have a house full of strong sons to help work the farm. And indeed, the children came regularly, as was expected on the frontier where large families meant more hands to work the land and insurance against the high childhood mortality rates. After William came Sarah in 1894, then the twins James and Mary in 1896, and finally little Samuel in 1898. Each birth was celebrated by the community, each healthy child seen as proof of God's blessing on the hard-working Yates family. Margaret threw herself into motherhood with the same determined perfectionism she brought to everything else. She made all their clothes by hand, taught them to read using the worn Bible her mother had given her as a wedding gift, and insisted on proper table manners even in their rough frontier home. Visitors often commented on how well-behaved the Yates children were, how clean and properly dressed, despite living on a working farm. But those same visitors began to notice subtle changes in Margaret as the years passed. Where once she had been quick to laugh and eager to chat with neighbors, she grew increasingly quiet during social gatherings. Her bright smiles seemed more forced, her laughter less frequent. When asked how she was managing with 5 young children, she would always give the same response. "The Lord provides strength for all burdens," delivered with a tight smile that never quite reached her eyes. The truth was that Margaret felt increasingly trapped in a life that seemed to be slowly suffocating her. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and with Thomas often traveling to sell crops or buy supplies, she would go days without speaking to another adult. The children, though beloved, were constant demands on her time and energy. There were meals to prepare, clothes to wash and mend, lessons to teach, injuries to tend, and discipline to maintain, all while managing the endless household tasks that kept a frontier family fed, clothed, and sheltered. The winter of 1897 brought unusual hardships to the Cedar Creek area. A late freeze destroyed much of the wheat crop, followed by a summer drought that left the community struggling financially. Thomas, like many farmers, was forced to travel farther and more frequently to find work, sometimes spending weeks away helping with cattle drives or working on larger ranches. These absences left Margaret completely alone with 5 children under the age of 5. Isolated on their remote farmstead, with no way to call for help if emergencies arose. It was during one of these lonely periods that the first truly disturbing incident occurred. Mrs. Helen Morrison, who lived on the neighboring farm, had stopped by to check on Margaret and noticed that little Samuel, barely a year old, had been crying inconsolably for what seemed like hours. When she knocked on the door, it took several minutes for Margaret to answer, and when she finally appeared, her hair was disheveled, her dress stained, and her eyes had a wild, unfocused quality that Helen had never seen before. "Margaret, dear, is everything all right?" Helen asked, trying to peer past her into the unusually quiet house. "Of course," Margaret replied, but her voice had a strange, high-pitched quality. "Everything is perfectly fine. The children are just resting." When Helen gently insisted on coming inside to help, she found the 4 older children sitting unnaturally still at the kitchen table, their faces pale and frightened. Baby Samuel was in his cradle, red-faced from crying, his diaper clearly unchanged for hours. The house, usually spotless, was in complete disarray. Dishes piled in the sink, clothes scattered on the floor, and a strange, sour smell that Helen couldn't identify. "Margaret, when did you last eat?" Helen asked, noting how thin and hollow-eyed her neighbor had become. Margaret stared at her for a long moment as if trying to process the question. "Eat? The children need to eat. They're always hungry, always needing something. I can't keep up with what they need." Helen spent the rest of the day helping Margaret clean the house and care for the children. But what disturbed her most was Margaret's behavior. She would start tasks and then abandon them halfway through, standing in the middle of the room with a confused expression as if she couldn't remember what she had been doing. She spoke to the children in a harsh, impatient tone that was completely unlike her usual gentle manner, and several times Helen caught her staring at baby Samuel with an expression that could only be described as resentment. When Thomas returned 2 days later, Helen made a point of speaking with him privately about her concerns. She tried to explain that Margaret seemed overwhelmed and might need help, perhaps a hired girl to assist with the children. Thomas listened politely but dismissed her worries with a wave of his hand. "Women get emotional sometimes, especially after having babies," he said matter-of-factly. "Margaret's always been a bit delicate, comes from growing up in the city. She just needs to toughen up, learn to handle things like frontier women do. She'll be fine." But Margaret wasn't fine, and the incidents began to multiply. Sarah Brennan, who ran the general store, mentioned to other women that Margaret had come in twice to buy the same supplies, seeming confused when Sarah pointed out that she had just purchased identical items the week before. During church services, several people noticed that Margaret would sometimes start crying quietly during hymns, tears streaming down her face while she stared straight ahead with an expression of profound sadness. The children's behavior began to change as well. William, the eldest at 6, started showing up at neighbors' houses asking for food, claiming his mother had forgotten to prepare meals. Little Sarah, normally a cheerful child, became withdrawn and clingy, refusing to let her mother out of her sight. The twins developed a habit of hiding under their bed whenever voices were raised in the house, and baby Samuel seemed to cry more than any child should. Dr. Benjamin Crawford, the circuit doctor who visited Cedar Creek once a month, examined Margaret during one of his visits after several women expressed concerns. He found nothing physically wrong with her, but noted in his private journal that she seemed nervous and melancholic, which he attributed to the natural hysteria that affects women of childbearing age. His prescribed treatment was rest, fresh air, and a daily dose of laudanum to calm her nerves. The laudanum did seem to help at first. Margaret's mood stabilized, and she was able to manage her household duties more effectively. But the medicine also made her drowsy and disconnected, and she began taking larger doses to achieve the same calming effect. Thomas, grateful that his wife seemed more manageable, readily purchased whatever medicine she needed and didn't question her increasing dependence on it. By the spring of 1898, Margaret's condition had deteriorated significantly, though she had become expertly skilled at hiding it from casual observers. She had learned to time her laudanum doses so that she appeared most normal during church services and social gatherings, presenting a carefully maintained facade of competent motherhood that satisfied most people's concerns. But those who looked closer began to see disturbing signs. The children's clothes, while still clean, were often mismatched or poorly mended. Meals became increasingly simple and repetitive. Cornbread and milk for breakfast, cold biscuits for lunch, and thin soup for dinner. The house, once a model of frontier domesticity, began to show signs of neglect. Dust accumulated in corners, windows went unwashed, and the vegetable garden that had once been Margaret's pride became overgrown with weeds. More troubling were the changes in Margaret's interaction with her children. She had always been a patient, nurturing mother, but now she seemed to view them as burdens rather than blessings. She would snap at them for normal childhood behavior, become frustrated when they asked questions, and sometimes ignore them entirely for hours at a time. The older children learned to care for baby Samuel themselves, taking turns feeding him and changing his diapers when their mother seemed unable to function. Thomas, when he was home, seemed oblivious to these changes. He was dealing with his own pressures, crop failures, mounting debts, and the constant struggle to keep the farm profitable in an increasingly difficult economic climate. When neighbors occasionally mentioned concerns about Margaret, he would brush them off with increasing irritation. "My wife is fine," he would say firmly. "She's just tired from taking care of 5 children. What woman wouldn't be? People need to mind their own business instead of gossiping about things they don't understand." The truth was that Thomas was deeply uncomfortable with any suggestion that his family wasn't perfect. In the rigid social structure of frontier life, a man's worth was measured not just by his own success, but by his ability to maintain a proper household. Admitting that Margaret was struggling would be tantamount to admitting his own failure as a husband and provider. During the long summer of 1898, Margaret's isolation became almost complete. She stopped attending church services, claiming that the children were too difficult to manage in public. She declined invitations to quilting bees and harvest celebrations, always with polite excuses about household duties that needed attention. Even when neighbors stopped by for visits, she would speak to them through the door, claiming she was too busy to receive company properly. The few people who did see her during this period were shocked by her physical deterioration. She had lost a significant amount of weight, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame. Her hair, once her crowning glory, was often unwashed and hastily pinned up. Her hands, never idle even during conversation, showed constant nervous tremors that she tried to hide by clasping them together. Most disturbing of all were her eyes. The bright green eyes that had once sparkled with intelligence and warmth now seemed flat and lifeless, as if something essential inside her had simply been extinguished. When she did speak, her voice had taken on a monotonous quality, and she often seemed to be responding to conversations that others couldn't hear. Baby Samuel's birth in late 1898 seemed to trigger a complete psychological collapse. The delivery was difficult, and Margaret lost a dangerous amount of blood, leaving her weak and unable to care for the infant properly. For weeks after the birth, she remained in bed, staring at the ceiling while the older children tried to manage household tasks they were too young to handle effectively. During this period, several neighbors offered to help, but Margaret refused all assistance with an almost violent determination. When Mrs. Morrison insisted on helping with laundry, Margaret became so agitated that she began screaming at her to leave, frightening the children and creating a scene that became gossip throughout the community. "She's not right in the head," people began to whisper. "Something's wrong with that woman, and those poor children are suffering for it." But despite these concerns, no one took decisive action. In 1898, there were no social services, no child protection agencies, and no real understanding of mental illness. A woman's behavior was considered her husband's responsibility, and unless she posed an immediate physical threat to others, the community was reluctant to interfere in family matters. The winter of 1898 to 1899 was particularly harsh, with unusually heavy snowfall that left the Yates farm isolated for weeks at a time. Thomas was unable to travel for work, which meant he was home more often, but also increasingly frustrated by their deteriorating financial situation. The strain on the family became unbearable, with 5 children crowded into a small house with 2 adults who were barely capable of caring for themselves, let alone their offspring. It was during this period that Margaret began to exhibit behavior that should have alarmed everyone who witnessed it. She started talking to herself constantly, carrying on elaborate conversations with invisible companions. When questioned about it, she would claim she was praying, but the words she muttered bore no resemblance to any prayers the devoutly Methodist community would recognize. The children became increasingly fearful of their mother's unpredictable moods. One day she might spend hours playing with them and telling stories, her old gentle nature briefly returning. The next day she might lock herself in her bedroom and refuse to come out, leaving them to fend for themselves while she wept or raged behind the closed door. 6-year-old William later told neighbors that his mother had begun waking the children in the middle of the night, insisting they needed to prepare for the journey. When asked what journey, she would become agitated and refuse to explain, instead forcing them to sit quietly in the kitchen while she paced the floor and muttered under her breath. Young Sarah developed a habit of wetting herself whenever her mother approached, as if her child's instincts recognized danger that adults couldn't see. The twins, barely 3 years old, began showing signs of severe anxiety, rocking back and forth, pulling their own hair and refusing to eat unless coaxed by their older siblings. Most ominously, Margaret's relationship with baby Samuel became increasingly disturbed. She would stare at him for hours, with an expression of intense concentration, as if trying to solve some complex problem. When he cried, instead of comforting him, she would sometimes join in his wailing, creating a cacophony of misery that could be heard across the fields. Dr. Crawford, during his monthly visit in March 1899, was finally forced to acknowledge that Margaret's condition had progressed beyond simple female hysteria. He found her sitting motionless in her kitchen, baby Samuel crying in her lap, while she stared straight ahead without blinking. When he spoke to her, it took several attempts to get her attention, and when she finally responded, her words were disconnected and strange. "They whisper at night," she told him matter-of-factly. "The children whisper, and they tell me things. Terrible things about what's coming. The burden is too heavy, Doctor, too heavy for anyone to carry." "Doctor." Crawford increased her laudanum prescription and suggested that Thomas consider sending her to stay with relatives in Austin until she recovered. But Thomas, now facing the possibility of losing his crops due to spring flooding, couldn't afford to lose his wife's labor and dismissed the suggestion as impractical. "She'll snap out of it," he insisted. "Women go through phases. She just needs to toughen up and remember her responsibilities." But Margaret wasn't snapping out of anything. If anything, her condition was accelerating toward a crisis that no one in the small community was equipped to handle. The signs were all there: the progressive isolation, the deteriorating care of the children, the increasingly bizarre behavior, and the growing sense among neighbors that something terrible was building in the Yates household like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. In May 1899, Margaret made what would later be recognized as her final desperate attempt to communicate the severity of her situation. She appeared at the home of Mrs. Morrison, disheveled and agitated, carrying baby Samuel, who was obviously ill with fever and malnutrition. "Helen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep them safe. Something terrible is going to happen, and I can't stop it. Please, you have to help me. You have to take them away from me before it's too late." Mrs. Morrison, alarmed by Margaret's appearance and words, tried to get her to explain what she meant, but Margaret had already begun backing away, shaking her head frantically. No, it's too late. They're telling me it's too late. The burden is mine to bear. I have to finish what was started. I have to free them from what's coming." Those were the last coherent words anyone would hear Margaret Yates speak. She turned and walked back across the fields to her house, baby Samuel crying weakly in her arms, leaving Mrs. Morrison standing in her doorway with a growing sense of dread that something unspeakable was about to unfold. Mrs. Morrison debated going after her, even considered walking to town to fetch Thomas from the general store where he was conducting business. But frontier etiquette strongly discouraged interfering in family matters without clear evidence of immediate danger, and Margaret's words, while disturbing, could be interpreted as the rambling of an exhausted mother rather than specific threats. It was a decision that would haunt Helen Morrison for the rest of her life, because within 3 weeks, Margaret Yates would act on whatever dark compulsion had been building in her tormented mind, and 5 innocent children would pay the ultimate price for their community's failure to understand the desperate warnings of a woman drowning in madness. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Yates household reaches its breaking point. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happened during those final, terrible days when Margaret Yates made the unthinkable decision that would shock an entire community. The first weeks of June 1899 brought an oppressive heat wave to eastern Texas, the kind of weather that made tempers short and minds restless. The thermometer at the Cedar Creek General Store regularly topped 100 degrees, and there was no relief even after sunset. In the Yates farmhouse, with its small windows and thick wooden walls, the heat became nearly unbearable, especially with 5 young children crowded into the small space. Thomas had left on June 18th for what he expected to be a 3-day trip to Houston, where he hoped to secure a better price for his wheat crop than the local buyers were offering. The family's financial situation had become desperate, and this trip represented their last hope of avoiding foreclosure on the farm. He kissed Margaret goodbye that morning, noting that she seemed unusually calm and quiet, but attributing it to the oppressive heat rather than any deeper concern. Keep the children inside during the hottest part of the day, he instructed, unconsciously speaking to her as if she were a hired hand rather than his wife. And don't let them waste water playing. We can't afford to have the well run dry. Margaret nodded silently, standing in the doorway with baby Samuel in her arms while the other 4 children clustered around her skirts. Thomas later remembered thinking that they made a peaceful domestic picture, a mother surrounded by her children, framed by the morning light streaming through the open door. It was an image that would torment him in the years that followed, when he understood that he was looking at his family for the last time. The first day after Thomas's departure passed quietly, according to the later testimony of neighbors. Mrs. Morrison, still troubled by Margaret's strange visit weeks earlier, made a point of watching the Yates house from her kitchen window while she worked. She saw the children playing in the yard during the cooler morning hours, their voices carrying across the fields in the still air. Everything seemed normal, perhaps even more peaceful than usual. But inside the house, Margaret was fighting a battle that no one could see. The voices that had been whispering to her for months had grown louder and more insistent, no longer content to remain in the background of her consciousness. They spoke with perfect clarity now, telling her things about her children that filled her with horror and desperation. The laudanum that had once helped quiet her mind now seemed to make the voices stronger. When she took her usual dose, instead of bringing peace, it seemed to open floodgates in her mind that she could no longer control. The bottle that Dr. Crawford had left with enough medicine for a month was already half empty, but the relief it provided was increasingly temporary and incomplete. On the morning of June 19th, Mrs. Morrison noticed that the Yates house seemed unusually quiet. No children's voices carried across the fields, no movement could be seen in the yard, and the usual smoke from the kitchen chimney was absent, even though it was time for the morning meal. Concerned, she decided to walk over after finishing her own chores, carrying a basket of fresh eggs as an excuse for the visit. When she knocked on the door, there was a long delay before Margaret answered. When she finally appeared, her transformation was shocking. In just 3 days, she seemed to have aged years. Her hair hung loose and unwashed around her shoulders. Her dress was stained and rumpled as if she had slept in it, and her eyes had a wild, frightened quality that made Mrs. Morrison instinctively step backward. "Margaret, dear, I brought some eggs," Helen said, trying to keep her voice calm despite her growing alarm. "How are you managing with Thomas away?" "Managing?" Margaret repeated the word as if it were foreign to her. "Oh yes, managing. We're managing very well. The children they're being very good. Very quiet. They understand now about being quiet." Mrs. Morrison tried to peer past Margaret into the house, but the interior was unusually dark, with curtains drawn across all the windows despite the bright morning sun. "Are the children feeling well? I haven't seen them playing outside." "They're resting," Margaret said quickly. "The heat, you know. It's important they rest during the heat. Thomas said to keep them inside, and I always do what Thomas says. I'm a good wife. I've always been a good wife." The conversation was stilted and strange, with Margaret responding to questions that hadn't been asked and ignoring the ones that had been. Most disturbing of all, Mrs. Morrison realized she couldn't hear any sounds from inside the house. No children's voices, no footsteps, no crying from baby Samuel, who had seemed constantly fussy in recent months. "Margaret, I'd like to see the children, just to make sure they're all right," Mrs. Morrison said, taking a step forward. The effect of these words on Margaret was dramatic. Her face contorted with fear and rage, and she gripped the doorframe so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "No," she said sharply. "No, you can't see them. They're sleeping and they mustn't be disturbed. They need their rest. They need to be ready." "Ready for what, Margaret?" But Margaret had already begun closing the door, shaking her head frantically. "You can't understand. No one can understand what it's like, the burden, the responsibility. But I know what has to be done. I know how to protect them." The door slammed shut, leaving Mrs. Morrison standing on the porch with a growing sense that something terrible was happening inside the house. She called out Margaret's name several times, but there was no response from within. After several minutes of indecision, she walked around the house, trying to peer through the curtained windows, but could see nothing in the dark interior. That evening, Mrs. Morrison discussed her concerns with her husband, Robert, who was reluctant to interfere in what he considered a family matter. "Margaret's always been a bit high-strung," he pointed out, "and it's natural she'd be nervous with Thomas away. We can't go breaking down doors just because a woman seems upset." But Helen Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. She spent a restless night, frequently checking the view toward the Yates house from her bedroom window. The house remained dark and silent throughout the night, with no sign of the normal domestic activities that should have been taking place. The morning of June 20th, 1899, dawned clear and brutally hot, with the sun rising like a malevolent eye over the Texas plains. Mrs. Morrison was up before dawn, unable to sleep, and she immediately looked toward the Yates house. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. Thin wisps of smoke were rising from the kitchen chimney, the first sign of activity she had observed in over a day. Relieved that Margaret seemed to be functioning again, Helen decided to wait until a more appropriate hour before checking on her neighbor. She busied herself with morning chores, periodically glancing across the fields. But as the hours passed, her relief transformed back into worry. The smoke had stopped after only a short time, and once again the house seemed unnaturally quiet. By 10 o'clock, when the Texas sun was already beating down mercilessly, Mrs. Morrison's anxiety had reached a breaking point. She convinced her husband to accompany her to the Yates house, using the excuse that she wanted to return a borrowed sewing basket. Robert Morrison was reluctant but agreed, perhaps sensing his wife's genuine distress. As they approached the house, both of them noticed the overwhelming silence. On a normal day, the yard would have been alive with the sounds of children playing, but now there was nothing except the buzz of insects and the whisper of wind through the wheat fields. The house itself looked neglected, with shutters hanging askew and the front porch littered with objects that should have been put away. Robert knocked firmly on the door while Helen stood behind him, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. They could hear movement inside, slow, shuffling footsteps, but it took several minutes before the door opened. Margaret appeared in the doorway, and both visitors were shocked by her appearance. She was wearing a clean white dress that neither of them had seen before, and her hair was neatly braided and pinned up. But her face was ghostly pale, and her eyes had a strange, glassy quality that made her look like a sleepwalker. "Good morning, Margaret," Robert said carefully. "We wanted to check on you and the children. Helen's been worried about you." Margaret stared at them for a long moment as if trying to remember who they were. When she finally spoke, her voice was eerily calm and formal, like someone reciting lines from memory. "How kind of you to call," she said. "I'm afraid the children can't receive visitors today. They're resting peacefully, finally resting peacefully." Something in her tone made both visitors deeply uncomfortable. Robert tried to peer past her into the house, but Margaret shifted to block his view. "Margaret, are you feeling all right?" Helen asked gently. "You look very pale." "I feel relieved," Margaret said, and for the first time a strange smile crossed her face. "The burden has been lifted. I've done what needed to be done. They're safe now. All of them are safe from what was coming." Robert and Helen exchanged alarmed glances. Robert cleared his throat and tried to speak with authority. "Margaret, I think we should see the children. Mrs. Morrison is concerned about their welfare." Margaret's calm facade cracked slightly, and her hands began to shake. "No one can see them. They're sleeping and they mustn't be disturbed. I've worked so hard to make sure they can sleep peacefully. They were so tired, you know, so very tired of carrying such heavy burdens." Helen Morrison felt a chill run down her spine despite the oppressive heat. Something was terribly wrong, and she suddenly understood that her worst fears about her neighbor might have come true. "Margaret," she said as gently as possible, "where are the children right now?" Margaret's smile returned, but it was unlike any expression Helen had ever seen on a human face, serene and terrible at the same time. They're upstairs in their beds, sleeping like angels. Perfect little angels who will never have to suffer again. I made sure of that. I'm a good mother, you know. The best mothers protect their children from suffering. Robert Morrison's face had gone white as the implications of Margaret's words sank in. Without asking permission, he pushed past her into the house, calling the children's names. Margaret didn't try to stop him. She simply stood in the doorway, that eerie smile still playing around her lips. The house was stifling hot and filled with a strange, sweet smell that Robert couldn't identify. The downstairs rooms were neat and clean, but completely empty of the clutter and noise that 5 young children should have created. He bounded up the narrow stairs, Helen close behind him, both of them calling for William, Sarah, James, Mary, and baby Samuel. What they found in the children's bedroom would haunt them for the rest of their lives. All 5 children were lying in their beds, tucked in neatly with clean sheets pulled up to their chins. They looked peaceful, as if they were simply taking an afternoon nap, but their skin had a waxy, unnatural pallor and they were completely motionless. Robert approached William's bed first, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch the boy's face. The skin was cold and rigid, and there was no doubt that the child had been dead for hours, possibly since the previous day. A quick check of the other children confirmed the horrible truth. All 5 of the Yates children were dead. Helen Morrison's scream of horror and disbelief echoed through the small house and across the fields, a sound so raw and primal that it seemed to tear the very fabric of the peaceful morning. Robert stood frozen in the center of the room, trying to process the enormity of what they had discovered. Downstairs, Margaret had closed the front door and was sitting calmly in her rocking chair, humming a lullaby as if nothing unusual had happened. When the Morrisons came running down the stairs, Robert shouting questions and demands for explanation, she looked up at them with genuine surprise. "You woke them up," she said sadly. "I worked so hard to make sure they could sleep peacefully, and you woke them up. Now they'll be frightened again." It was then that Robert Morrison noticed the empty bottle on the kitchen table, the laudanum that Dr. Crawford had prescribed for Margaret's nerves. Next to it was a smaller bottle that had once contained paregoric, a medicine commonly used to treat children's stomach ailments. Both bottles were completely empty. The terrible truth was becoming clear. Margaret had given her children fatal doses of the opium-based medicines, probably mixed into their food or drink to mask the bitter taste. She had then carefully tucked them into their beds and waited for the drugs to take effect, believing in her disordered mind that she was protecting them from some unnamed horror. Robert Morrison ran from the house to summon help, leaving his wife to keep watch over Margaret, who seemed completely disconnected from reality. Helen sat in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face, while Margaret continued to rock and hum, occasionally making comments about how peaceful the children looked and how glad she was that they were finally safe. When the sheriff arrived an hour later, followed by Dr. Crawford and several other men from town, Margaret greeted them politely and offered to make coffee, as if they were paying a social call. She showed no resistance when they went upstairs to examine the children, and when they returned with grave faces to confirm what everyone already knew, she nodded as if they had delivered exactly the news she expected. It was the only way, she told them matter-of-factly. They were going to suffer so much. The voices told me what was coming, the terrible things that would happen to them if I didn't act. A good mother protects her children from suffering, even if it means making the hardest sacrifice of all. Dr. Crawford examined the children and confirmed that they had died from opium poisoning, probably administered the previous evening. The peaceful expressions on their faces suggested that they had simply fallen asleep and never awakened, unaware of what was happening to them. Thomas Yates returned from Houston that evening to find his world completely destroyed. The sheriff met him at the edge of town to break the news, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of his 5 children lying still and silent in their beds, or his wife sitting calmly in the parlor, asking him how his business trip had gone, as if nothing had happened. The man who had left 3 days earlier as a struggling but hopeful farmer returned to find himself the sole survivor of a family that had been systematically destroyed by the very person he had trusted to protect it. Thomas collapsed beside William's bed, his anguished cries echoing through the house as the full reality of his loss finally hit him. Margaret watched her husband's breakdown with detached curiosity, occasionally offering comfort in the same tone she might use to console a child with a scraped knee. "Don't cry, Thomas," she said gently. "They're safe now. I made sure they're safe from all the terrible things that were coming. Isn't that what a good mother should do?" When Dr. Crawford attempted to question Margaret about her actions, her responses revealed the depth of her psychological deterioration. She spoke matter-of-factly about the voices that had been telling her for months that her children were in danger, describing elaborate scenarios of suffering that would befall them if she didn't act to protect them. "They told me William would grow up to be a violent man, that he would hurt people," she explained with the same calm tone she might use to discuss the weather. "And little Sarah. They said terrible things would happen to her, things that no mother could bear to imagine. The twins were going to suffer from hunger and cold, and baby Samuel. Oh, the things they said about baby Samuel were the worst of all." The voices she described seemed to be a combination of her own fears about frontier life amplified to an unbearable degree. Every real danger that frontier children faced, disease, violence, poverty, early death, had been magnified in her disturbed mind into certainties that could only be prevented by the most drastic action imaginable. Dr. Crawford's examination revealed that Margaret had been planning the murders for at least a week. She had carefully hoarded laudanum and paregoric from multiple sources, telling different people that she needed the medicines for various ailments. She had also spent considerable time preparing the children's final meal, a special supper that she had described to them as a celebration, complete with cookies and milk that she had laced with enough opium to ensure peaceful deaths. The investigation revealed other disturbing details about Margaret's final days. She had written several letters that were found hidden in her bedroom, addressed to relatives in Austin but never sent. In these letters, she described her growing conviction that unspeakable horrors awaited her children and her determination to deliver them to God's protection before these tragedies could occur. One letter, written to her mother, was particularly chilling in its matter-of-fact description of her intentions. "Dearest Mother, by the time you might have received this letter, I will have completed the most difficult task that any mother has ever been called upon to perform. Do not mourn for the children, for they are beyond the reach of suffering now. I have given them the greatest gift any mother can give, eternal peace and safety in the arms of the Lord." The community's reaction to the tragedy was complex and troubling. While everyone expressed horror at the deaths of 5 innocent children, there was also a disturbing undercurrent of relief that the problem of Margaret's difficult behavior had finally been resolved, even in such a terrible way. Several people admitted privately that they had known something was seriously wrong, but had felt powerless to intervene in what was considered a private family matter. Mrs. Morrison, tormented by guilt over her failure to act on her suspicions, spent hours being questioned by authorities about Margaret's behavior in the weeks leading up to the murders. Her detailed accounts revealed a pattern of warning signs that, in retrospect, seemed to point clearly toward the approaching tragedy. "She kept talking about protecting the children," Helen told the sheriff through her tears. "But I thought she meant protecting them from normal dangers, wild animals, accidents, illness. I never imagined she meant protecting them from life itself." The legal proceedings that followed were swift and conclusive. Margaret was declared mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to the state lunatic asylum in Austin, where she would spend the rest of her life. She never expressed remorse for her actions, maintaining until her death 15 years later that she had done the right thing and that her children were better off dead than facing the horrors that life would have brought them. Thomas Yates sold the farm and left Cedar Creek immediately after the funerals, unable to bear living in the place where his family had been destroyed. He was never seen in the area again, though rumors persisted for years that he had changed his name and started a new life somewhere in the Western Territories, trying to escape the memories of that terrible summer. The Yates house stood empty for several years before being torn down by the county. Local residents claimed it was haunted, reporting strange sounds and lights in the windows during the long Texas nights. Whether these phenomena were real or simply the product of guilty consciences and traumatized memories, no one was ever brave enough to investigate. The Yates family tragedy raised uncomfortable questions about frontier life that the community of Cedar Creek was reluctant to address. How many other women were struggling with similar psychological pressures in isolation, with no support system and no understanding of mental illness? How many warning signs were being ignored or misinterpreted throughout the scattered farming communities of the American frontier? Dr. Crawford, deeply affected by his failure to recognize the severity of Margaret's condition, began studying what little was known about mental illness in women. He discovered that cases similar to Margaret's were more common than anyone wanted to admit, particularly in isolated frontier communities where women were expected to manage impossible burdens with no help or understanding. In his private papers, discovered after his death, Dr. Crawford wrote extensively about the Yates case and its implications. "We have created a society that places impossible demands on women, particularly mothers, and then acts surprised when some of them break under the pressure." Margaret Yates was not born a killer. She was created by circumstances that would have challenged the sanity of any human being. The tragedy also highlighted the dangerous lack of understanding about mental illness in the 19th century. Margaret's obvious symptoms of severe depression and psychosis had been dismissed as female hysteria or nervous exhaustion, conditions that were treated with ineffective remedies and moral judgments rather than genuine medical intervention. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that the community had failed these children not through malice, but through willful blindness. The signs of Margaret's deteriorating mental state had been visible to many people, but the social norms of the time made it nearly impossible for anyone to take effective action. The story of the Yates family murders became a cautionary tale that was whispered about in farming communities throughout Texas for generations. Parents used it to teach their children about the importance of looking out for neighbors, and communities began to develop informal support systems for isolated families. But the deeper lessons of the tragedy, about the crushing pressures placed on frontier women, the dangers of untreated mental illness, and the responsibility of communities to protect their most vulnerable members, were largely ignored. It would be many decades before American society began to understand the complex factors that could drive a loving mother to commit such an unthinkable act. The 5 Yates children were buried in the Cedar Creek Cemetery in a small plot that Thomas purchased before leaving town forever. Their headstones bear simple inscriptions with their names and dates of birth and death, but nothing that hints at the terrible circumstances of their passing. Over the years, the graves have become a place of pilgrimage for people fascinated by the darker aspects of frontier history, though most visitors leave more disturbed than satisfied by their encounter with this tangible reminder of tragedy. Local historians have documented several other cases from the same era involving women who committed violence against their own families under similar circumstances, suggesting that the Yates tragedy was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of psychological breakdown among frontier women. These cases, while less well documented, paint a picture of an epidemic of mental illness that was ignored, misunderstood, and ultimately fatal for numerous families. The medical journals of the period contain scattered references to what doctors called prairie madness or frontier fever, terms used to describe the psychological breakdown that seemed to affect women living in isolated circumstances. But these conditions were typically attributed to moral weakness or female fragility rather than recognized as legitimate mental health crises requiring proper treatment. Margaret Yates spent her remaining years in the Austin Asylum, where she was recorded as a model patient who caused no trouble and seemed to live in a world entirely separate from reality. She never spoke about her children or acknowledged what she had done to them, instead spending her days in activities that suggested she believed they were still alive and waiting for her to return home. Asylum records describe her as spending hours each day preparing imaginary meals for 5 children, setting places at tables that existed only in her mind, and having animated conversations with invisible companions who she insisted were her sons and daughters. To the end of her life, she maintained the delusion that she had saved her children from terrible suffering, and that they were living happily in some alternate reality where the dangers of frontier life could not touch them. The Yates family murders represent one of the darkest chapters in the history of American frontier settlement, a stark reminder that the romanticized vision of pioneering life often concealed brutal realities that destroyed families and shattered communities. The story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the price of westward expansion, particularly the costs paid by women and children who were expected to endure impossible hardships with grace and silence. Margaret Yates was not a monster, despite the monstrous nature of her final acts. She was a woman who was failed by every system that should have protected her and her children, medical, social, and familial. Her tragedy illuminates the dangerous gaps in understanding and support that characterized frontier society, gaps that proved fatal for 5 innocent children who deserved better from the adults responsible for their welfare. The fact that warning signs were visible for months before the murders makes the tragedy even more heartbreaking. In a different time and place, with better understanding of mental illness and stronger community support systems, Margaret Yates might have received the help she desperately needed. Her children might have grown up to live full lives, contributing to the building of the American West, rather than becoming victims of its harshest realities. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Yates story is how easily it could have been prevented, and how many similar tragedies might have occurred in the isolated farmsteads and frontier settlements, where families struggled alone against overwhelming odds. The silence of the Texas plains holds many secrets, and not all of them are as well documented as the fate of the Yates family. This mystery shows us the deadly consequences of isolation, untreated mental illness, and a society's failure to protect its most vulnerable members. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there darker secrets still buried in the Texas soil? The frontier was a place where people could disappear without a trace, where families could be destroyed without anyone noticing until it was far too late. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think there were other cases like this that were never discovered? How many other Margaret Yates were out there, struggling in silence until they reached their breaking point? If you found this tale as haunting as we did, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from America's darkest chapters. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the mysteries that others dare not explore. And share this video with someone brave enough to confront these uncomfortable truths about our nation's past. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones created by the very society that claims to protect us. See you in the next dark corner of American history.